Why did she hesitate before opening the door that morning, as if her body already knew the day would cost her something? Grace Donnelly stood still for half a second longer than usual, her hand resting on the cafe handle, breath caught somewhere between habit and instinct. The mason mug had always smelled the same at dawn: burnt coffee, lemon cleaner, old wood warmed by sunlight. But that morning something felt heavier. Not ominous, just weighted, like the silence before a rotor starts turning. She pushed the door open anyway. The bell chimed, familiar, reliable, the kind of sound you stop noticing only after it's saved you 100 times. Grace moved with quiet precision behind the counter, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back, blue flannel faded from years of spills and rewashes. She didn't rush. She never did. People who came here didn't need speed. They needed steadiness. At 35, Grace wasn't striking. She didn't command attention when she entered a room. No sharp edges, no practiced charm, but there was something about her presence that softened spaces, like she'd learned how to take pressure without passing it on. That hadn't come naturally. 6 years earlier, she'd learned how loud silence could be, learned how a knock at the door could split a life clean in two, learned how uniforms folded into triangles could weigh more than a body. Staff Sergeant Michael Donnelly, killed in Helmand Province, official language, clinical, precise, the kind of words that didn't bleed until later. Grace had survived that the way she survived everything else, by staying useful. The cafe became her mission, not a business, a post, a neutral zone where no one had to explain their hands shaking or their eyes scanning exits, where dogs slept under tables without questions, where coffee refills came without judgment. Every Wednesday at 9 sharp, the veterans arrived. They didn't announce themselves, they never did. They filtered in quietly like men and women trained not to take up space. Different wars, different decades, same eyes. This is a place to be seen, Grace always said, not fixed. She never asked them to talk. Somehow they always did. That morning, she had already poured the first pot when the door opened again. Ray McMillan stepped inside. Late 50s, broad shoulders pulled inward, the posture of someone who had learned to make himself smaller without realizing it. Recon Marine, retired, the kind of man who didn't sit unless he trusted the ground. At his side walked Shadow. Black coat, shepherd mix, red vest with white block letters, service dog, do not pet. Grace met Ray's eyes and nodded once, window tables open. He nodded back, that was their language. Shadow guided him to the far corner and settled instantly, body curved protectively, eyes alert but calm. The room adjusted around them without anyone saying a word. Then the door opened again. And the air changed. The man who entered didn't pause, didn't scan, didn't soften, navy blazer, pressed slacks. Clipboard held like authority itself had weight. His shoes clicked against the floor with intent. Logan Prescott, his badge read, State Health Inspector. Grace felt it immediately, that tightening just below her ribs. Not fear, calculation. How can I help you? She asked. Unannounced inspection. Of course it was. He moved methodically. Refrigerator seals, temperature logs, surface wipes. He didn't look at people when he spoke, only objects. Then he saw Shadow. He stopped short. That animal is in violation of state health code. The word animal landed hard. Heads turned, conversations thinned. Grace stepped forward, voice even. He's a registered service dog. Ada law permits his presence. Prescott's mouth tightened. I don't care what vest he's wearing. Animals carry dander, hair, saliva. This is a food establishment. Ray's hand clenched around his mug. Shadow didn't move. Grace inhaled slowly. I won't ask a veteran to leave, she said, and I won't ask his service dog to leave either. Prescott stared at her like she'd just spoken a foreign language. Then you're choosing to violate compliance. "No," Grace said quietly. "I'm choosing dignity." For a moment, no one spoke. Then another voice cut in. "Grace Donnelly." Deborah Lyall stood near the door, regional manager, corporate polish, eyes sharp with calculation. "You've just violated policy in front of a state inspector," she said. "You're terminated." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Grace felt the impact like recoil, immediate, controlled, absorbed. She looked around the cafe, at Ray, at Shadow, at the chalkboard that read Hero's Hour, free coffee for vets. She untied her apron, folded it carefully, set it on the counter. "Make sure Ray gets his refill," she whispered to Lena. Then she walked out. She didn't know someone was filming. She didn't know that 35 minutes later, the ground would shake. She only knew she'd done what she couldn't live without doing. And somewhere miles away, a Marine colonel who owed his life to quiet places like hers was about to get a phone call he would not ignore. Sometime, the most decisive moments don't announce themselves. They just happen. And the world shifts afterward. Why did the windows start to hum before anyone heard the engines? For a long moment after Grace walked out, the cafe existed in a strange suspension. Coffee steamed. Cups sat untouched. Conversations hovered unfinished, like sentences no one wanted to end. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, unsure what came next without her anchoring it. Lena stood frozen behind the counter, hands still wrapped around a ceramic mug that had gone cold. She kept expecting Grace to come back through the side door, apron retied, expression calm, as if the firing had been some misunderstanding that could be corrected with a firm but polite sentence. But the door stayed closed. Ray hadn't moved either. He remained standing beside his chair, shoulders squared now, not defensive, not angry, just alert. Shadow lay at his feet, chin resting on paws, eyes tracking every shift in the room. The dog sensed it too, something unfinished. Logan Prescott cleared his throat. "Inspection will continue," he said, trying to reclaim control with words that suddenly felt too small. No one responded. Deborah Lyall avoided eye contact, tapping on her phone as if data might rescue her from the weight settling over the room. Then the vibration came. At first it was subtle. A low-frequency tremor felt more than heard. Coffee rippled inside cups. The spoon Lena had dropped earlier rattled against the counter. Someone near the window frowned. "Is that thunder?" The sound grew deeper, heavier, not rolling, approaching. Ray's eyes narrowed. He knew that sound, knew the rhythm of it in his bones. Engines. Military grade, diesel, multiple. Chairs scraped as people stood and turned toward the windows. Outside, the quiet charm of Main Street Mason fractured as 4 Humvees rolled into view, tires grinding against pavement, engines humming with disciplined restraint. They didn't speed, they didn't blare sirens. They arrived like they belonged there. The vehicles pulled into the cafe lot in a clean, deliberate line, blocking the entrance as if drawn by a ruler. Doors opened almost in unison. Marines stepped out. Dress blues. Perfect lines, crisp angles, ribbons catching the light, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself because it carried its own gravity. At their center stood Colonel Richard Gaines. Inside the cafe, Logan Prescott's clipboard slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. Deborah Lyall took a step back without realizing it, heels tapping against tile. No one spoke as the Marines formed up on the sidewalk, boots aligned, eyes forward. They stood at attention in front of a coffee shop that smelled like burnt beans and lemon cleaner. The bell over the door jingled once. Colonel Gaines entered alone. His boots struck the floor with slow precision. Each step echoed, not loud, measured, controlled. He scanned the room once, took in the details, the chalkboard, the photos, the posture of the people standing inside. Then his gaze found Ray. For a fraction of a second, Something softened behind the colonel's eyes. Ray straightened fully and gave a small, respectful nod. Colonel Gaines returned it, not with words but with a salute. A full, formal salute. Prescott swallowed hard. I didn't know he was. The colonel didn't look at him. You don't need to know who someone is, he said calmly, to treat them with dignity. He turned toward Lena. Is Grace Donnelly here? Lena shook her head, throat tight. She was fired, she said, for standing up for Mr. McMillan and his dog. For the first time, the colonel's jaw tightened. That woman, he said slowly, has done more for this base than some federally funded programs. Ray cleared his throat. The sound surprised even him. She didn't ask questions, he said. His voice was rough, unused. Didn't make me explain, she just let me sit. Shadow shifted, tail thumping once against the floor. The colonel nodded, absorbing the words like orders received. Then he turned toward the door and raised his hand. Outside, the Marines moved. Not aggressively, not theatrically, just with purpose. 2 Marines entered and carefully removed the corporate logo from the wall, peeling it away with the reverence of folding a flag. Another stepped forward and replaced the chalkboard with one they'd brought with them. It read, "Welcome to Grace's house, where honor is served daily." Deborah Lyall stepped forward, panic cracking through her composure. "You can't, this is private property, corporate." "You made your decision," Colonel Gaines said, finally looking at her. His gaze was steady, unyielding. "Now we'll make ours." Outside, phones buzzed, messages flew, videos uploaded. Inside Grace's truck, parked at the edge of her driveway, her phone vibrated again and again. She ignored it. She sat there gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white, staring at the road. Fired. Just like that. 6 years of building something real erased by policy language. She felt stupid for being surprised. Institutions didn't like complications, or conscience. Her phone buzzed again. This time she looked. "Requesting your presence at Fort Granger headquarters, today." No explanation, no tone. Grace exhaled slowly. Fort Granger had once been familiar. As a military wife, as someone who learned the rhythms of deployment cycles and homecomings that never quite landed. Now, as she passed through the gates, she felt like an outsider again. Colonel Gaines met her at the entrance. Not in dress blues this time. Khaki uniform, relaxed posture, authority worn lightly. "Grace Donnelly," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." She shook it, uncertain. "I'm not sure why I'm here." He smiled faintly. "Let me show you." He led her down a corridor lined with portraits and maps, until they stopped at a door labeled Veteran Transition and Wellness Initiative. Inside, folding chairs sat stacked against the wall. Therapy mats lay unused. Boxes of donated supplies waited unopened. "This program been stalled for 2 years, Gaines said. On paper it's perfect. In practice it's missing something." Grace crossed her arms. "I'm not a clinician." "No," he agreed. "You're something better." A young woman stepped forward from the back room. Burned scars traced her jaw and arms. A golden retriever pup walked beside her, vest marked "in training." "I saw the video," she said quietly. "I haven't been to a coffee shop since I came home, but I think I could sit in a place you run." Grace felt her chest tighten. "We want you to lead this," Gaines said. "Not manage it, shape it." Grace thought of the cafe, of Ray, of Shadow. "I'll do it," she said. Sometimes, losing one mission is how you're reassigned to another. And Grace Donnelly was just beginning to understand that the quietest acts of defiance often open the loudest doors. Why did the silence inside the new center feel heavier than the silence she had left behind? Grace noticed it the first morning she unlocked the door alone. No bell chimed. No coffee grinder hummed to life on its own. No familiar shuffle of boots or low murmurs drifting in before the sun fully rose. just still air and fluorescent lights that flickered once before settling. She stood there for a moment, keys still in her hand, unsure if she was early, or if this place simply didn't know how to wake up yet. The Veteran Transition and Wellness Center looked clean in the way unfinished things often do. Too neat, too empty, folding chairs stacked precisely, whiteboards wiped down until they squeaked, boxes labeled supplies and donations unopened, waiting for permission to matter. Grace set her bag down and exhaled slowly. She had run a cafe for years. She knew how to make a space breathe. This one felt like it was holding its breath instead. By mid-morning, a few staff members arrived. Young, earnest, careful with their words. They asked her questions like people ask someone stepping into authority without a uniform. What's the intake process? Do we schedule group sessions? What's the policy on animals? Grace listened, took notes, didn't rush answers. We'll figure it out together, she said. But first, we make this place feel human. She rolled up her sleeves and opened the boxes. Coffee mugs appeared first, not matching ones, different shapes, different weights, some chipped, some new. She lined them up near the counter she insisted on installing despite mild resistance from logistics. Coffee machine, one staffer asked. Yes, Grace said, not optional. By noon, the smell of brewing coffee drifted down the hallway. It wasn't strong yet. Not like the cafe, but it was something. At 12:17 p.m. the door opened. Grace felt it before she saw it, that shift in air, the subtle tightening in her chest that told her someone was deciding whether to stay. A man stood just inside the doorway, early 30s, hands shoved deep into his pockets, eyes scanning exits automatically, his haircut still regulation short but his posture no longer matched it. He didn't step forward. This the place? He asked. Grace didn't ask for his name, didn't ask for paperwork. Yes, she said gently, come in if you want. He hesitated, then crossed the threshold like it might trigger something unseen. He didn't sit, just stood near the wall, shoulders rigid. Coffee's hot, Grace added, no rush. He nodded once. By the end of the hour, 2 more arrived, then another. No announcement, no fanfare, just quiet entry, quiet observation. Grace watched them carefully, the way she had learned to. Who chose the corner seats, who kept their backs to the wall, who flinched when someone laughed too loudly down the hall. She didn't push conversation. She poured coffee. She listened. By the end of the week, the chairs were no longer stacked. Word spread the way it always does, not through flyers or official emails, but through whispers. A place where you didn't have to explain, where dogs were welcome, where silence wasn't treated like a problem. Ray showed up the following Tuesday. Shadow walked in like he'd been waiting for the building to catch up to him. He went straight to a far corner and lay down, chin on paws, completely at ease. Grace smiled before she could stop herself. You found us, she said. Ray shrugged, figured Shadow would. They sat without speaking for a long time. That night Grace stayed late, reorganizing shelves that didn't need reorganizing. When she finally sat down, exhaustion hit her all at once. Not physical, emotional, the kind that seeps in when adrenaline fades. She pulled Michael's old watch from her bag, turned it over in her palm. The glass was scratched, the leather band cracked from years of wear. She hadn't told anyone yet, not the colonel, not the staff, that part of her hesitation about taking this role wasn't doubt. It was fear. Because leadership meant attachment, and attachment meant loss. She had already buried one life built around service. She wasn't sure she could survive losing another. The doubts didn't leave, they waited. They showed up 2 weeks later with clipboards. Auditors, civilian clothes, neutral expressions. They observed quietly, asked careful questions, watched interactions like they were data points instead of people. Grace answered everything honestly. "What certifications do you hold?" one asked. "I don't," she said. "What qualifies you to oversee trauma-informed programs?" "Consistency," Grace replied, "and respect." The man wrote something down, didn't react. That night Grace drove home in silence, hands gripping the wheel harder than necessary. Old instincts resurfaced, the ones that told her she was standing on borrowed ground, that this was temporary, that she should prepare for the floor to drop out. She parked and sat there longer than usual. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. Michael's boots still sat by the door. She never moved them, not out of grief exactly, out of continuity. Some things anchored you whether you realized it or not. She sank onto the couch and let the weight finally settle. "What if they take this too?" she whispered into the empty room. No answer came. The next morning she returned anyway. Because she always did. Weeks passed, then months. The center grew, not bigger but deeper. Veterans brought spouses, parents, children who didn't know how to ask why their dad stared out windows too long. A whiteboard appeared near the coffee counter. Who needs a ride? Who needs a listener? It filled faster than anyone expected. Tiffany came every Tuesday, still quiet, still guarded, but her sketchbook grew thicker, dogs, hands, faces half turned toward light. One afternoon, she slid a drawing across the table toward Grace. A woman standing behind a counter, coffee steaming, a dog asleep at her feet. Grace swallowed hard. "You see yourself differently than we do," Tiffany said softly. Grace didn't respond, she couldn't. The call came on a rainy Thursday. Colonel Gaines stood in her office, arms crossed, unreadable. "They want to expand the program," he said. Grace's heart sank before it lifted. "They." "Department level." She stared at him. "That's good." "It is," he said, "but it means scrutiny." Grace nodded. She understood scrutiny, had lived under it without realizing for years. That evening, she returned to the cafe for the first time since leaving. Lena was behind the counter. "You're supposed to be famous now," she teased, sliding a mug toward her. Grace smiled softly. "I'm just here for coffee." The cafe had changed. Photos lined the walls, new faces, familiar energy. Near the register, a sign read, "Grace's Corner, where no one sits alone." Grace traced the edge of the counter with her fingers. Maybe places don't disappear, she thought. Maybe they just move. And sometimes, the quietest leadership doesn't look like command. It looks like showing up again the next day. Even when you're afraid. Sometimes especially then. Why did the praise feel heavier than the criticism ever had? Grace noticed it the moment the first article ran. Not the headline, she avoided those, but the way people started looking at her. Longer pauses, softer voices, that careful distance people create when they don't want to say the wrong thing to someone they've placed on a pedestal. She didn't like it. The center hadn't changed, not really. Coffee still brewed too strong, dogs still curled under chairs, silence still settled where words failed. But now there were cameras outside sometimes, reporters asking for just a quick quote, emails marked urgent that somehow said nothing at all. Grace answered what she could, deflected what she didn't need. She kept reminding herself, this place wasn't about her. Still, attention has a way of finding cracks. The first real fracture came quietly. It was a Tuesday afternoon, rain tapping against the windows, when a man she didn't recognize raised his voice in the common room. Not yelling, just louder than necessary. His hands trembled, his leg bounced. The room tensed instantly. Grace felt it like a pulled muscle. She crossed the room slowly, careful not to crowd him. "You don't get to tell me I'm fine," the man said to no one in particular. "You weren't there." No one contradicted him. Grace didn't either. She sat down across from him, far enough away to give him space, close enough to matter. "You're right," she said. "I was." The man's breath hitched, his anger deflated into something else, something raw. Later, one of the staff pulled her aside. "We should document incidents like that," they said, "for liability." Grace nodded. "We will." But that night, driving home, the words replayed. "You weren't there." She hadn't been, not in uniform, not on patrol, not behind a rifle or in a cockpit. Her service had always been adjacent, supportive, quiet. And suddenly, she wondered if that would ever be enough. The doubt followed her into sleep and surfaced again weeks later when the auditors returned, this time with more questions and less patience. One of them leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Your outcomes are impressive," he said, "but they're difficult to quantify." Grace met his gaze evenly. "So is trust." He smiled thinly. "Trust doesn't scale." That sentence lingered long after they left. Colonel Gaines found her later, standing alone near the coffee counter, staring at nothing. "They don't know what to do with you," he said. Grace shrugged. "They don't have to." "But they will try," he replied gently. That evening, Ray stayed behind after everyone else left. Shadow slept near the door, completely at ease. "You okay?" Ray asked. Grace hesitated, then nodded, then shook her head. "I don't want this to become something loud," she admitted. "I'm afraid if it does, we'll lose what made it work." Ray considered that. "Loud doesn't always mean empty," he said, "but I get it." He paused. "You ever regret not enlisting?" The question surprised her. Grace thought of Michael, of letters, of nights staring at the ceiling counting hours until morning. "No," she said slowly, "but I regret believing there was only one way to serve." Ray nodded. "Yeah, they teach us that early." The invitation arrived 3 weeks later. Washington, D.C. National Veterans Advocacy Conference. Keynote civilian speaker. Grace read the email twice, then a third time. Her stomach tightened. "I'm not a speaker," she told Colonel Gaines. "You're a witness," he corrected. The night before she left, Grace packed lightly. One blazer, one notebook, Michael's watch. At the airport, the crowd noise pressed in. Announcements echoed. Luggage wheels rattled like distant gunfire. Grace stood near the gate, shoulders tight, grounding herself with slow breaths. "Need an escort, ma'am." She turned to see Ray standing tall in dress blues, Shadow at his side. She laughed before she could stop herself. It came out shaky. "They really did that." Ray grinned. "Figured you shouldn't walk in alone." The conference hall was larger than she expected. Bright lights, rows of faces, cameras perched like unblinking eyes. Her name appeared on the screen behind the podium. Grace felt suddenly small. When she stepped up to the microphone, the room quieted. She didn't start with a story. She started with a pause. "I'm not a general," she said. "I'm not a doctor. I didn't write policy. I ran a cafe." A few people smiled. Others leaned forward. "I served coffee near a military base," she continued, "and I listened." Her voice steadied as she spoke, not louder, truer. "One day, I got fired for refusing to ask a veteran and his service dog to leave. That was the moment everything changed. But the truth is, it was never about coffee." She looked out at the room, at the faces, the uniforms, the civilians. "It was about dignity," she said. The applause came slowly, then all at once. Later that night, Grace stepped outside alone. The city hummed around her. Sirens, footsteps, life in motion. A man approached quietly, gray suit, white beard, kind eyes. "You don't remember me," he said. She shook her head. He handed her a photograph. Old, faded. Michael stood in it, smiling, coffee in hand. Beside him stood an older man in uniform. "You poured me coffee the day I got my medical discharge," the man said. "You didn't say anything, you just smiled." Grace's throat closed. "I kept that photo," he continued, Because that day you reminded me who I was. Back home, the center welcomed her not with ceremony, but familiarity. A young veteran stood near the doorway, uncertain. Is this the place for people like me? He asked. Grace smiled softly. No, she said, this is the place for people like all of us. Later alone, she added 2 photos to the wall, one from the conference, one from the cafe. Below them, she wrote a simple line. Honor grows where kindness is consistent. She stepped back and looked at it. For the first time in a long while, the weight lifted, not because the responsibility was gone, but because she finally understood it. Leadership wasn't about volume. It was about presence. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the letter feel heavier than any rejection ever had? Grace didn't open it right away. It sat on the corner of her desk for most of the morning, cream-colored envelope stamped with an official seal that caught the light every time she shifted in her chair. The Department of Defense insignia wasn't subtle. It never was. It carried weight before a word was even read. Colonel Gaines had placed it there himself. "You'll want a moment," he'd said, then quietly left her office. Outside, the center hummed with low life, coffee brewing, a door opening and closing, someone laughing too suddenly, then apologizing for it. The normal sounds of a place that had learned how to exist with pain instead of trying to erase it. Grace watched Shadow trot past her doorway, tail low but relaxed. Ray followed a moment later, nodding when he saw her, not asking questions. He'd learned, like she had, that timing mattered. She finally picked up the envelope. Her fingers hesitated at the edge, a familiar instinct kicking in, the one that warned her that official words often carried unintended consequences. Orders, notices, condolences. She had lived long enough inside military language to know how cleanly it could cut. She opened it anyway. Halfway through the first paragraph, her breath caught. She read it again, then again slower this time. You are hereby nominated. Grace lowered the page. No, she whispered, not in disbelief but in resistance. The words felt wrong, too grand, too polished for what she had done. She hadn't planned a movement, hadn't strategized impact. She poured coffee. She'd listened. She refused to step aside when it mattered. That didn't feel like something you got commended for. It felt like something you were supposed to do. Colonel Gaines knocked lightly and stepped back in. You don't look thrilled, he said. Grace let out a shaky breath. I don't deserve this. He leaned against the doorframe. That's usually how it works. The letter wasn't just a commendation. It was an invitation. Washington again. A formal ceremony, a speech, cameras. Visibility. Grace felt the familiar tightening in her chest. The center was fragile in ways spreadsheets didn't capture. It thrived on trust, on the sense that this wasn't another institution waiting to disappoint them. What happens if this turns into a symbol instead of a place? She asked. Gaines met her gaze. Then we fight to keep it a place. That night Grace walked the center after hours, turning off lights, straightening chairs that didn't need it. She paused at the wall of photos, faces, names, stories that trusted her not to turn them into slogans. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lena. They're talking about you on the news. I muted it. Come by if you need coffee. Grace smiled faintly. At home she packed slowly. The same notebook, Michael's watch, a folded photo she hadn't meant to bring but couldn't leave behind. The morning of the ceremony, Ray arrived early. Dress blues again, shadow freshly brushed, vest crisp. They said escort detail, Ray said. I volunteered. Grace raised an eyebrow. Of course you did. At the Pentagon the air felt different, controlled, polished, every step echoed. Grace sat waiting, hands folded, watching officers and officials pass by. So many uniforms, so many stories she would never know. When her name was called, she stood. The applause came, but she focused on one thing, the weight of Michael's watch on her wrist. Solid, real. As the medal was placed around her neck, the words washed over her. Distinguished service, civilian contribution, exceptional commitment. She nodded when required, smiled when expected. But what stayed with her wasn't the ceremony. It was what came after. A young woman approached her quietly near the exit. No uniform, no badge. "My brother comes to your center," she said. "He doesn't talk much, but he sleeps again. I just wanted to say thank you." Grace's eyes burned. Later, at the reception, someone asked her the question she'd been waiting for. "What's your next move?" Grace set her glass down carefully. "The same one," she said. "Show up tomorrow." Back in Mason, life didn't pause. The center was full the day she returned. A new group sat in the corner, women this time, younger, quieter. One of them held a baby monitor like a lifeline. Grace noticed, she always did. She sat with them, asked nothing, offered coffee. That evening, after the last door closed, Grace finally allowed herself to feel it all. The exhaustion, the pride she didn't know how to name, the grief that still surfaced when she least expected it. She sat alone by the fire pit, staring into the flames. "I wish you could see this," she murmured. In her mind, Michael smiled the way he used to when she talked herself into something difficult. Not proud, not surprised, just steady. The call came 3 days later. National expansion, pilot program approved, her model. Grace closed her eyes as the colonel spoke. "Say no if you want," he added quietly. Grace thought of the cafe, of the moment she'd untied her apron, of how small that decision had felt and how far it had traveled. "I won't leave," she said, "but I'll share." That night, she wrote a single sentence on the whiteboard near the coffee counter. "This place exists because someone once refused to look away." People read it silently, some nodded, some wiped their eyes. Ray stood beside her afterward. "You good?" he asked. Grace considered the question carefully. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm still here." Ray smiled. "That's usually enough." As the lights dimmed and the center settled into its familiar quiet, Grace felt the weight again. But this time, it wasn't crushing. It was anchoring. Because she finally understood something the uniformed world had taught her slowly, and life had taught her faster. Service doesn't end when the spotlight turns on. That's when it's tested most. Why did the quiet feel different now? Less like absence, more like arrival. Grace noticed it on an ordinary evening, the kind that used to slip past unnoticed. The sun was low, turning the windows amber. The center was nearly empty. A few chairs still warm from bodies that had sat there long enough to exhale, then leave lighter than they arrived. She stood alone near the coffee counter, rinsing a mug she'd already cleaned once. Not because it needed it. Because her hands needed something steady. So much had happened that it felt unreal. The letter, the ceremony, the phone calls that still came in waves, the way her name now traveled ahead of her into rooms she hadn't entered yet. And still the work hadn't changed. A young veteran sat outside by the fire pit, shoulders hunched, staring into the flame like it might speak first. Grace didn't interrupt him. She pulled a blanket from the shelf and draped it gently over the back of his chair as she passed. He nodded without looking up. That was enough. She walked the perimeter the way she always did at closing. Lights dimmed, doors checked, photos straightened. The wall had grown crowded now, faces from different eras, different wars, different lives intersecting for a moment in this place. She stopped in front of one photo in particular. The Café. Taken the day after the Humvees arrived. People shoulder to shoulder, dogs under tables, coffee in every hand, no fear, no hierarchy, just connection. Grace pressed her palm lightly against the glass. "You were never supposed to end," she whispered. The cafe hadn't closed. It had expanded. The sound of footsteps pulled her back. Ray stood nearby, shadow at his side, leash loose, trust absolute. "They're waiting for you," he said. Grace raised an eyebrow. "Who?" He tilted his head toward the common room. She stepped inside and stopped. They were all there. Not lined up, not formal, just gathered. Tiffany, Lena, the young mothers, the older men who rarely spoke. Even a few staff members had stayed late, uncertain but present. Colonel Gaines stood near the back, arms crossed, deliberately silent. Grace swallowed. "What's going on?" Lena stepped forward first. She held something small in her hands. "We wanted to give you this before you disappear into the next big thing," she said, smiling nervously. Grace took the object. It was a key. Old, worn, the cafe's side door key. The one Grace used to carry on a ring by itself because it mattered more than the rest. "We bought the place," Lena said quickly, like ripping off a bandage. "Well, some of us did. Investors tried first, but the town pushed back, said it didn't feel right without you." Grace stared at the key, breath shallow. "We're reopening it," Lena continued. "Not as a chain, not as a brand, just a place." Tiffany spoke next, voice quiet but steady, "For when people aren't ready for the center yet." A murmur of agreement moved through the room. Grace felt something inside her give way, not break. "Release. You don't have to run it," Ray added gently. "Just keep it connected." Grace looked around the room, at the faces, at the trust. She nodded once. "Okay," she said. Her voice didn't shake, but the rules stay the same. No one asked what she meant. They already knew. The reopening was quiet. No press, no speeches, just the bell over the door ringing again for the first time in months. Grace stood behind the counter, blue flannel on, hands steady. She poured the first cup herself. A man entered hesitantly, younger than most. No dog, no visible scars, just eyes that had seen too much too early. "Is this?" he started. Grace nodded. "Yeah, it is." He sat. Outside, life moved on. Cars passed, people hurried. The world didn't stop for quiet places. It never does. Weeks later, Grace received another invitation. Another panel. Another opportunity to scale, replicate, systematize. She declined. Instead, she wrote a letter. Not official, not polished. Just honest. "If you want to know why this works," she wrote, "it's because it refuses to rush people into being okay." She pinned a copy to the whiteboard at the center. That night after everyone left, Grace sat alone by the fire pit. The flames danced low, steady. She pulled Michael's watch from her wrist and held it in her hands. "I figured it out," she said softly, as if he were sitting across from her. "Why I stayed, why I couldn't walk away." The answer didn't come in words. It came in memory. The cafe door opening, a dog lying down, a man breathing easier. She fastened the watch back on. Inside, the center was quiet, but not empty. It never was. Near the entrance, a new sign hung, simple and unassuming. "You don't have to be strong here." Grace turned off the last light and stepped outside, locking the door behind her. She didn't linger. She didn't need to. Because legacy, she had learned, isn't built in grand gestures or loud moments. It's built in the spaces we protect when no one is watching. It's built in the dignity we offer when rules would make it easier not to. Grace Donnelly never wore a uniform. She never held rank. But she understood something many never do. That service doesn't always march. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it listens. And sometimes, when the world demands you look away, service is simply the courage to stay. Because dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't demand applause. It doesn't even ask to be remembered. It just acts. Quietly. Consistently. and it changes everything.